All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Alaska Municipal League and American Security Project for today's discussion on regional solutions to global problems, specifically focused on climate security in Alaska. Pleased to be joined today with our guest speaker, who I'll introduce in a moment. For those of you who are online, do feel free to utilize the Q&A function. We'll be able to take questions throughout and get to them as we can, and really encourage your participation, which will help our conversation overall. My name is Nils Andreassen. I'm the Executive Director of the Alaska Municipal League. Have been in this role for 3 years now, serving Alaska's 165 cities and boroughs, our local governments, and really working to strengthen local government in Alaska. Prior to this role, I served as 10 years as Executive Director of the Institute of the North, which focused on Arctic everything. And in that role, we contributed to the Arctic Council Sustainable Development Working Group and projects therein, helped to host Arctic Energy Summits, and also helped facilitate Alaska's Arctic policy and climate policy. So the Arctic is not new to me, though when it comes to local governments in Alaska, most municipal officials are focused on day-to-day operations and that improve the lives and livelihoods of residents. We know that global problems require regional and local solutions, but how that works, especially as it relates to climate, is incredibly difficult. So excited about this conversation today, and again, encourage you to ask questions throughout. Our speaker today is retired Brigadier General Stephen Cheney, and he's the president of the American Security Project. General Cheney is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy with over 30 years experience as a Marine. His career has included a wide variety of command and staff positions with operating forces and the supporting establishment. I should say something about your artillery experience, but it won't be maybe so relevant in the Arctic, we hope, right?
We hope.
General Cheney has served in a variety of roles, otherwise Chief Operating Officer for the Business Executives for National Security in Washington, and most recently was President CEO of the Marine Military Academy in Texas. He's appeared in multiple speaking engagements, and most recent testimony was on energy security, climate change, and cyber to the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. He's been on the board of directors for the American Security Project since 2006 and served as their CEO from 2011 to 2019. General, thanks so much for joining us today and for helping Alaskans think about Alaska, right, in relation to the Arctic, this regional aspect, and to this global challenge that we're faced with climate change. I'm going to turn it over to you to further or better introduce yourself, but would really welcome your remarks on this topic.
Well, Nils, thank you for that kind introduction, and I appreciate what the Alaska Municipal League does, and I know it's all for the good of everybody in Alaska and the country, so we appreciate that. This is really a unique day in the whole year in regards to what's going on in Alaska and our national security, and I say that because for two reasons. First off, the National Defense Authorization Act was passed today by the Senate for 2022. I mean, they've been working on it for a year. And there was a lot of hand wringing and people screaming, thinking it wasn't going to get done by the holidays, but it did. And there are parts of that that are relevant to Alaska. I'll talk about that in a minute. Plus that, for those of us inside the Beltway who read the local press, the Washington Post had a big front page article today on the Arctic and Antarctic and the melting and some of the impacts on national security. So I just mentioned that because a lot of times when I talk to folks outside the Beltway, they think, you guys never think of us. And in some cases, of course, that's true. But when it appears on the front of the Washington Post in a multi-page spread, then I can tell you it's got people's attention, and well, it should have people's attention. So what I'm going to do a little bit here is talk about the American Security Project for a couple of minutes. Then I'm going to get into climate security as it relates to national security. Then I'm going to talk specifically about Alaska for a little bit. And then at the end, we can close it up and go to a open Q&A. American Security Project is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization, and we focus on the U.S.'s long-term national security threats. Our work examines topics like nuclear non-proliferation, counterterrorism, energy security, and of course today, climate security. And there's an intersection here between a lot of those, especially in Alaska. Now we've got a board that was originally comprised of 3- and 4-star generals and admirals. Many of them are still on the board. The organization was founded in 2004, 2005 by Senators Kerry, Hagel, Hart, and Rudman. And the line I like to use is coming off the 2004 election. Then Senator Kerry wasn't particularly happy with the results. But what he was equally unhappy about was that when he talked about issues that I just mentioned, in particular climate change, he got somewhat painted as the left-wing liberal that he is, and people wouldn't listen. And so he sat down with Chuck Hagel, Republican, of course, and said, how can we get this message across that climate change is impacting our national security if people are going to put so much politics into it? And their thought was to create a research organization, and they'll start with generals and admirals who had no political leaning left or right. Their really sole purpose was to talk national security and security of the country. So that's how the board was formed. And it's survived now quite well. Our current chairperson is Governor Christine Todd Whitman of New Jersey. And I'm proud to say that. And she's also a Republican. So we go both ways. Chuck Hagel is still on the board. Of course, John Kerry is not, because he had to drop off when he took his job as climate czar in the White House. In addition to what we have on the board, we have a cadre of retired general and what we call flag officers, generals and admirals, as well as former senior government officials and ambassadors in a group we call the Consensus for National Security. And the consensus members support key policy measures that are designed for a smart and comprehensive 21st century national security. And we rely on them to host forums nationwide, other public events, and use them to help educate decision makers about the dangers of failing to address today's threats, specifically climate change. And we don't do this just inside the Beltway. We have traveled to 18 states plus over the past decade or so, talking this specific issue. And the line I like to use is we go to where the rubber meets the road. The people who are directly impacted by climate change are feeling the effects and understand it. And then we relate that to national security and bring that message back inside the Beltway. So we can talk, we can go up on the Hill, and we can do some limited lobbying as a 501c3. And I've been in the offices of both your senators. And as you mentioned, I have testified in Congress as well, really about climate security and national security. So let me talk a little bit about climate security here at home. Taking a step back, I'll talk about the broader national security threats posed by climate change. And I'm going to do some quoting here. According to the Department of Defense's annual list of challenges confronting the Department of Defense, quote, rising seas, extreme weather such as flooding, wildfires, hurricanes, and a melting Arctic will require the Department of Defense to consider the security, readiness, and financial implications of these non-traditional threats. And that's a direct quote from the Department of Defense. Now, just as recent as this last October, the White House and the U.S. intelligence community and the Pentagon all released reports that conclude that climate change can, one, impact strategic interests around the globe, can alter relationships with rivals like China and Russia, will also present new opportunities, and climate change will also destabilize nations, some that have nuclear capabilities. So you can see there is a genuine threat here. In a statement included in the Pentagon's report, Defense Secretary General Lloyd Austin right now said, quote, climate change is altering the strategic landscape and shaping the security environment, posing complex threats to the United States and nations around the world. Further on that quote, to deter war and protect our country, the Defense Department must understand the ways climate change affects missions, plans, and capabilities. I mean, that's important. And I will look back over the previous 4 years before the Biden administration. This issue was hard to discuss, and not to throw a political slant on this, but as you probably know, there were significant deniers among the Trump administration and some in the Department of Defense. But I will tell you that those on the ground, the military folks, certainly understood what climate change was doing to their bases and stations and how it was impacting instability throughout the world. At ASP, we have long discussed the ways that climate change, extreme heat, drought, wildfires, storms, sea levels, how they threaten U.S. national security and our interests. Let me address military installations that I just touched on a second ago. They're all equally affected by extreme heat, coastal flooding, wildfires, and nothing new to Alaskans, permafrost thaw. Military installations in Alaska are located in a place that provides tremendous national security benefit. And today, more than ever now, when you look over the horizon, we start to worry. When you see what Putin's doing in Russia, what he's doing above the Arctic Circle, the threat that poses to our country, and the direct threat of missiles perchance coming over, the way they're going to get uncovered is with Alaska, with your radar and detectors. And somewhat this applies to China as well. We really have to worry about China. China has 2 icebreakers. How many do we have? 2. Hard to believe. They're not an Arctic nation, but we are. ASP has long pushed for having additional icebreakers. They've now budgeted for another 1. The current commandant of the Coast Guard said he needs 6. And as you can tell, we're very heavy leaning on the Congress to budget for more and get more icebreakers. Just as a point of reference, Russia has 40. So to put that into context, and of course, we don't have a deep sea naval port anywhere, let alone not in Alaska, and we think we need one of those too. Providing the U.S. With a place to operate in the Arctic Circle and monitor Russian actions will continue to have paid huge dividends for our national security, and it's going to be more important in the future than it is now. You are all well aware there are 9 military bases in Alaska that serve these vital roles in the local community and with national security. But the military infrastructure is being directly impacted by climate change. And I'll just name some of them. You're familiar with them: Eielson Air Force Base, Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, Fort Greely, Fort Wainwright, and of course the Alaska radar system, which I mentioned a minute ago. They're all at risk of weakening building foundations. For example, early radar warning systems are being damaged by the thawing permafrost and coastal erosion, and we have to adapt, rebuild, move if possible. Now, given the international implications of climate change and the direct threat to base installations, Congress and DoD are working to make U.S. military installations more resilient in the face of increasing temperatures, coastal flooding, and permafrost thaw. Now, I mentioned the NDAA. The 2021 National Defense Authorization Act expanded funding for existing programs and created others to further address military base resilience, and required the Department of Defense to update the 2014 DoD Climate Adaptation Roadmap, and DoD is doing that. Now, the 2022 NDAA, which passed today, also included a provision specifically instructing installation commanders to form partnerships with local communities to build climate resilience. And of course, that was across the entire country, but it's particularly apropos to Alaska. The military has long recognized the threat climate change poses and knows that action is needed now to preserve military preparedness and to prevent paying later, as the cost of doing nothing is so exceptionally high. And policymakers at all levels have to follow their lead and take care of their communities. Let me expand this for a bit and talk about climate security abroad. The U.S. isn't just worried about the potential damage to infrastructure and readiness that climate change poses stateside. We're also worried about the national security implications of climate change abroad. We know that big international problems around the world don't just stay there. Eventually, they impact us here. The U.S. has an interest, of course, in a stable, predictable world, not one with civil unrest, not one with ethnic strife, not one that has fragile governments and that has failing ecosystems. But I think that's probably a nirvana. We are always going to have those and be faced with that, and will cause a threat to us. Now, climate change alone will not cause conflict, but it exacerbates the existing problems, such as water availability, food production, migration, overpopulation, and economic insecurity. All of these issues have the potential to make conflict much more likely. And in addition, climate change is creating new missions for the US military, like, no surprise, naval surface patrols in the Arctic and humanitarian and disaster relief response at home and abroad. And of course, when you only have 2 icebreakers, and now that the Northern Sea Route is opening up and you will see dramatically increased traffic up there, this becomes a safety problem as well. Now, however, destabilization of strategically important areas may be the result of climate-induced changes, not just the actions of foreign powers or terrorist organizations. And this is why we call climate change an accelerant of instability or a threat multiplier. I'm sure you've heard that before, but it really applies. With changing geography in your region, the thawing terrain has presented problems for the stability and reliability of infrastructure on such military installations that provide the ability for the US to monitor and respond to such events of international concern. Now, predicting where, when destabilizing events are going to occur might not be possible. It may, however, be possible to identify the areas where the risks are significantly higher. Perhaps one of the most critical national security implications from a warming Arctic is the opening of the new trade routes and the increasing accessibility of previously inaccessible resources. And you see this all the time going around with Russia and above us and Canada. This has changed the geopolitical dynamics of the region. And as Russia and China have intensified interest in the region, we've got to be aware. Now, the American Security Project had long done previous work identifying Russia's expanded military presence and increased investments in their military and industrial infrastructure in the Arctic. So this is an issue we've been looking at for years. In 2018, China announced that it seeks to take advantage of the opening trade routes to build a polar Silk Road under its Belt and Road Initiative, which you may be familiar with. Even more pressing, the new economic opportunities the Arctic has facilitated a deeper economic partnership between Russia and China. They just had a summit yesterday. And this has serious national security implications for the United States. Those 2 countries are getting together and they're ganging up on us. Many of these novel challenges from increased Russian and Chinese activity in the Arctic are a direct result of climate change and warming temperatures, and which has to come to some degree causing destabilization in the region. And to mitigate these risks, we need a systemic, dynamic, and deliberate approach for incorporating climate-induced changes into strategic action. So, where are the US leadership opportunities? Unfortunately, even if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases today, there's enough in the atmosphere to perpetuate climate-induced threats literally for decades to come. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try. In fact, it makes it more imperative that we as a global community achieve net zero carbon emissions as soon as we can. And the US can lead the way. But first, we got to catch China. US businesses are at serious risk of falling behind global demands as infrastructure changes, and China is at the head of new technologies in the world, particularly in wind, solar, and battery production. And of course, they're also working hard on nuclear, which we should be doing more as well. China, hard to believe, is the world's largest employer in the renewable energy sector, solar, wind, and hydropower, and has been for the last 5 years or more. In 2018, China alone was responsible for 42% of the new renewable power that was added globally. In 2019, more electric vehicles were sold in China than the rest of the world combined. In 2020, Alaska led the world in renewable energy growth, including installing more wind power and more than anywhere else, more than any other country in the world combined. But through strategic public and private investment in clean energy technology, we can catch China. And it serves 4 big purposes. One, it creates job opportunities for Americans in the clean energy tech sector, and it helps make US companies more competitive vis-a-vis Chinese competitors, strengthening the US's relative power. And hey, it reduces US carbon emissions, and it offers other countries an alternative to Chinese developed technology. And additionally, investment in and export of clean energy technologies, the US can create strong bonds with its allies in areas of strategic interest to the United States, to include, for instance, South Asia and Central America. Let me talk about some regional solutions to address climate change. I'd like to bring us back to why we are here. Climate change poses an existential threat to Alaska and the Arctic region. And the Arctic region is increasingly important to the United States national security, as I pointed out. It's imperative that Alaska incorporates regional climate change solutions to protect its infrastructure, protect your native population from being disproportionately affected, which it is, and to maintain national security. ASP has been looking at this issue for a long time. We've done it in several other states. One in particular was Florida. Florida, in many ways, faces the same challenges as Alaska. They're currently facing unprecedented challenges with both coastal and inland flooding, intense periods of heat, and increasing frequent extreme weather, particularly hurricanes. And Florida is important to national security too, as they host many important military bases and infrastructure. I'm going to use them as an example to respond to these challenges and enhance regional collaboration in developing climate change solutions. They organized 10 regional planning councils and organized them under one entity, the Florida Regional Councils Association. Now, these regional planning councils are made up of the local governments located in that particular region, and they work together to already has a basic framework to build off of. And no surprise, the Alaska Municipal League has already done a lot of the groundwork in uniting the relatively isolated cities and boroughs under one common operating framework. This can be extended and enhanced using resources already established within the Alaskan Department of Commerce. The Alaskan government has Alaska Regional Development Organizations, acronym ARDORs, which function like Florida's regional planning councils, and it tries to enhance regional collaboration, specifically focusing on economic development planning. Economic development efforts tailored to the specific characteristics of the region will be critical in addressing the threats from climate change. For example, as many of you will know, offshore wind may be the best solution for a coastal town, while solar panels may be the best solution for an inland town. And all of this new and existing infrastructure will need to be resilient to the risks from climate change, like melting permafrost. Now, in this way, AML is in prime position, as AML already represents 97%, Nils, as you know, of Alaska's residents, with the mission of being the unified voice of Alaska's local governments. AML can function similar to Florida's Regional Councils Association, and it can be a voice and coordinating mechanism between the local communities, state resources, and get federal funding to implement regional climate change solutions. Now, I know I've talked a little bit longer than I should, but in conclusion, let me do another quote from Secretary Austin. Planning for today and into the future is our business, and we would not be doing our job if we weren't thinking about how climate change will affect what we do. We in the military spend a lot of time mitigating risk. Climate change has become not only an existential threat to Alaska and the Arctic, but it's a threat multiplier that impacts national security and everything the military does. It can no longer be ignored. The rapid action and investment is needed now to protect U.S. interests and maintain our national security. Resilience measures must be taken while also mitigating the threat through new technologies and cuts to greenhouse gas emissions. The security challenges I've talked about will continue to be a problem and will worsen unless we dramatically reduce our emissions. The world's beginning to fight climate change, but the United States really needs to step up and lead. So Nils, that's kind of my pitch. I know, I talked a little bit long, but I think Alaska is on the forefront of this. This couldn't have been timed better, to be honest with you. And I think you've got the attention of Washington. So with that, let me turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, General. better you talk more than me, right? So I think that's how this works. Really appreciate your remarks and that review of kind of where we've been and where we're at. I do have, well, I'll encourage folks on the line to post questions in the Q&A function, and we'll try to get those addressed. I've got a number spurred by your comments, Steve. I don't, it feels, so I guess just to start at the beginning, it feels like for 20 years, Alaskans were saying, we're here, we're here, we're here, right? And Arctic and then climate. Alaskans have spent a long time trying to get the attention of Washington about Arctic and Northern issues. And there have been different administrations, over the last 10 years who have taken Arctic and climate seriously or not. How do we make sure there's continuity between administrations so that Washington remains focused on this topic and not just focused on it, but provides a planning mechanism to keep that attention on addressing both the threat, the risk mitigation, and the opportunity that you described, kind of this race to renewables. What does Washington need from Alaska? I know we need lots from Washington.
Well, I'm going to touch a little bit on the political side of this, and you all are familiar with it, but the issue is somewhat prominent in the Obama administration, and they made good progress there, not progress as much as we at ASP would like, but they did. In came the Trump administration and almost threw everything out the window. And I say almost, with the exception of DOD. They had programs like, it's called Net Zero, where their bases and stations would ultimately be independent of the local grid and would be producing their own power, and in fact, giving power back to the local grid. That program still exists and is going full bore today, and it should. And there are several bases and stations that are independent of local grid and produce their own power. So I think when you look at the national security side of it, again, going back to my military experience, I'll go back to Parris Island, where I was the commanding general back in 99, 2000, 2001. We had floods somewhat routinely, but not that much. Well, it's dramatically increased of late. And they've had some hurricanes that have impacted the basin station. We recognized this back then, and we tried to fund to build a seawall. Still hasn't been built. But I can tell you the current commander, who had to evacuate that base twice in the previous 2 years because of hurricanes, understands the impact of climate change. So it's a lot of it's dependent on the Department of Defense. And that's why I harken back to Alaska, which, Parris Island's important to the Marine Corps. I will tell you the radar system that you have in Alaska is far more important. That threat is there. And, you see what's going on in China with their missiles and they're now nuclearization and building more nuclear weapons. Alaska becomes pretty important in this regard. So that's just one aspect. Now, to get that translated from administration to administration is tough. In rolls the Biden administration. And of course, they took one of our founding fathers and former board members, John Kerry, and made him the climate czar, which was a good thing. And they also have a climate czar for the United States. So they have really put a lot of effort into this. My suspicion would be that if a Republican got elected here in 3 years, a lot of those programs might die off. But that said, local communities and states come back and say, hey, wait a minute, our bases are sinking through the permafrost. You started this. We've got to either what they call adapt. They have to adapt or rebuild or relocate. We can't just stop that because we got a new administration. The threats aren't going to go away because we get a Republican administration in 3 years. I mean, those threats are going to be there. So I think that's part of it. And if, not to say if there's any value to it, but you have two great senators and they're two great Republicans. And they understand this issue backwards and forwards, I can tell you. And so from that perspective, they will be the continuity if a Republican administration comes in. You get a Democratic administration, I suspect, but can't promise. Well, if it's Biden who gets reelected, obviously these programs are going to flourish and continue. Maybe not in the same way, but I think there'll be much more emphasis on it. So again, hearkening back to where the rubber meets the road, it's the folks that are most impacted on a daily basis here, and you are the ones who can say, hey, I don't care who's in office. We need to survive. We need to protect the country. We need to have our defense establishment. We need to reduce emissions. So that's a whole nother issue that I can address. But that's the way Nils, that's the way I would go about that.
Yeah, no, I can appreciate that. And I think that national security apparatus, Department of Defense, being that continuity is important. And I think that's increasingly true, that the Arctic and climate have taken on a place of importance for Department of Defense that keeps building. So that's great. One of the things that I wrestle with often is how to reconcile, what's a national threat, what's a threat to the nation versus, for Alaska's perspective, local needs, subsistence and infrastructure and quality of life and economy, and that middle piece of regional infrastructure. And you talked about military bases, and we're experiencing that, across the state for any number of different kinds of infrastructure. How, like, those feel like three very different, discordant discussions, and priorities placed by different groups of people. Any thoughts on how we tie those things together, or maybe we don't have to? How do we place an emphasis on each that helps to address each?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned Parris Island. Well, I hate to denigrate my former command, but the national security risk, the climate change affecting Parris Island is not going to dramatically impact our national security. The radar station sinking through the permafrost will impact our national security. So I think from that perspective, there are locations within Alaska that are more important to our national security and to the United States than many bases and stations here in the continental United States. I mean, it's a proven fact. And now when you add in the China and Russia part of this, and I didn't even get into the Chinese fishing fleet, which is thousands of ships now starting to encroach on other countries' territorial waters for fishing, and that's going to happen in Alaska. I mean, and fishing is one of your big economic benefits in Alaska. I mean, there's another one that there's a national security perspective to this, but it's also going to affect you locally, big time. And of course, when the Northern Sea Route opens up, which it already has opened up, there are ships going through, and there are going to be many, many more. And the Chinese have said they're going. That will impact you as well, and it also becomes a safety issue. And that's why Russia will tell you the reason they have 40 icebreakers and the reason they're building more in bases and stations is they're going to tax anybody going through the Northern Sea Route, and they will provide the safety for it. Now, I buy some of that, but I don't buy all of it. But nonetheless, you can see the impact that's having on them and the impact it's going to have on us. So there is no doubt that DoD dollars will impact your local economy in a big way, And I mention that because we haven't had a base realignment and closure commission now for literally decades, and we probably won't, because the congressional appetite is not there. But if they ever did, I can see your bases and station increasing, whereas others in the continental United States would decrease. And every Secretary of Defense has said they've got 30+% excess bases and stations that they just can't close because of congressional liabilities. But on the flip side of that, there's also bases and stations that need to increase or get bigger. And I see that from the Alaskan perspective. So I think tying it to the national security side of the house, especially and the DoD perspective, is important, and it ought to be. And I know your economy, you've got a significantly oil-based economy. I understand that. We're not getting off oil for a long, long time. So that's going to exist. But I think ultimately now, that's another avenue, and it's another perspective here. You're going to have to think about trying to move away from a fossil fuel-based economy. But that's a topic of discussion for another day.
Yeah. And we certainly, on that latter point, I know that ends up being kind of this philosophical crisis that we often come up against in terms of climate's impacts and our impacts to climate. I do like, though, that you tied national security to impacts at the local level, and ways to tie those three pieces together. So I really appreciate that. The Department of Defense kind of has three missions in the art, well, anywhere, but I think the way I understand it or think about it is sovereignty, security, and safety. And that might be shorthand. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's how I've heard it described. And I kind of like, it's an easy way for me to think about it. And I think sovereignty is really important because you talked about Russia and China, an Arctic nation and an Arctic adjacent nation is how they refer to themselves. So America's place in the Arctic is important from a sovereignty perspective, and the way we exert sovereignty is through physical presence. So military bases, icebreakers, etc. That's crucial to America's sovereignty. Security, though, kind of is harder. You talked about the radar bases that might be important. Our ability to mobilize from Alaska is important, but in terms of threat to Alaska is very different than thinking about a threat to more critical infrastructure elsewhere in the nation. I think the bulk of America's presence in the Arctic currently ends up kind of dedicated to safety, emergency response, cruise ship traffic, search and rescue. Those kinds of assets are really more visible from an Arctic perspective than others. But am I thinking about those things correctly, or is there another angle to that I'm missing?
No, you're spot on all three of those. Sovereignty, security, and safety. But let me talk sovereignty. I'm going to take each one of those for a second. Sovereignty first. You see, we're obviously want to protect our lands and want to recognize where our territorial waters are. And I'll just touch on this one issue for a second, because it's been a hot issue for ASP for decades. It's the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, which virtually every other country in the world is signed up to, but us. And so it's kind of hard when you don't even have a seat at the table to sit there and talk about challenges to your sovereignty and to people encroaching on your territorial waters when we never even signed up to it. And I don't think I'm much far away from this, but our biggest argument is not with Russia, it's with Canada, and talking about the Bering Strait. And they've filed claims with UNCLOS, but we haven't. But I'm not going to say, I'm not going down that rabbit hole today, but one of these days you'd think we would sign up to UNCLOS, but we have not. Another one on the sovereignty side of the house, don't think Russia and China don't know that our radar stations are where they are and where they're located, and not to say they're a target, but they need to be protected and hardened and make sure they're safe and secure, and they understand that as well. So, I mean, there's a bit of I would feel a bit of concern about that, and it's a little bit of a vulnerability, if you will. On the same, that applies, of course, on the security side of the house. Safety it's an interesting one. When the Crystal Serenity navigated the Northern Sea route, it took its own icebreaker with them, and they had another ship with its own sonar, because about 75% of the Northern Sea route is uncharted. And what do I mean by that? I'll give you a very sad example. We had the USS Connecticut submarine run into a seamount here in the Pacific Ocean about 2 months ago now. And it was navigating underwater in the far Pacific, but the same thing applies to parts of the Northern Sea route. So they're uncharted. You're not going to go there, or you're going to take sonar equipped ships, or you're going to have to chart them. And of course, and it seems, some would say it's counterintuitive to want to build more icebreakers when we're going to have less ice. The ice is melting, but it's melting into icebergs, and everybody's familiar with Titanic, et cetera, but you're going to have much more floating ice pieces around the Northern Sea route. Hence, you need an icebreakers to safely navigate those waters, and hence the requirement now for more icebreakers. And that safety part of it is huge. And there's a communication issue here You may recall Shell used to be drilling up in the Arctic, and they brought in a lot of their own communication equipment. Then they gave up, and some threw their hands up and said, my God, they're going to take their communications equipment with us. There's woefully inadequate communications capability in the Arctic, in the Northern Arctic. And that needs to be improved and built up. It needs to be funded. And it's a big vulnerability for us, and it's a safety issue, of course, for you Alaskans. So those three issues are all tied very closely together.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed the conversation or the discussion. I don't know if you said race to renewables, but it seems like that's the right phraseology for kind of us competing against other nations. And, generally, as we're thinking about climate change, the real solution there is moving away from fossil fuels at some point, or, knowing that transition will occur. I have to be careful too, right? Because we're a fossil fuel economy in a lot of ways. But tell me more about this race to renewables, and how is Washington thinking about that? There's a national security case. I imagine there's a business case. How else can we be thinking about or advancing that concept?
Yeah, it's an all of the above answer to this. I know that there have been indigenous villages in Alaska that have been moved because permafrost has melted them, and they've sunk. So, there's a direct impact of climate change on those villages. A lot of those villages, I would think almost all to a point, might rely upon fossil fuels for their power. You got to fly in the diesel or cart it in somehow. And part of the solution to their power problems is half the year, at least, having solar, and then maybe another half of the year having wind, of which you have a fair amount, especially on your coastal villages. So, there's a power solution for those villages that are that vulnerable. In terms of going to renewables nationwide, or certainly as a national concern, I can tell you from the DoD perspective, the quote I like to use is General Jim Mattis when he was in Iraq. He said, I wish we could get off this tether of fossil fuels. And we had well over 1,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines literally killed in Iraq and Afghanistan because they were guarding fuel lines and fuel trucks. And it killed him, because he said, hey, if I didn't have to do that, if I had renewable energy, if I had solar energy that I could use, if I had maybe even wind power or recharged trucks, he wouldn't need those fuel caravans. And the same thing applies today. Bases and stations are now becoming more independent. I can tell you that DoD is working hard on trying to convert all their vehicles to renewables. The number one consumer of fossil fuels in the country is the Department of Defense. And the same thing applies. And the biggest reason for that is the number of airplanes they have. The Air Force is huge, thousands and thousands of airplanes, all burning fossil fuels. But a guy like, for instance, Fred Smith at FedEx has now run his entire air fleet on biomass fuels for his airplanes. So that can be done. And it's another way of getting off of fossil fuels per se, and stopping this tremendous pollution of the atmosphere with CO2. And of course, the number one contributor to that is the transportation sector. So and lastly, I'll close on this one. There's been a lot of talk, some about nuclear power. Now, we at ASP, and some look at us and think, oh, well, you left-wing liberals. No, we're not left-wing liberals. We are strong supporters of nuclear power. The problem with nuclear power today is it has expensed its way out of the business. To build a new nuclear power plant in the United States literally cost billions, many billions of dollars. And to amortize that out, you're not going to get a return on investment. So we're building none right now. Whereas China's building them like crazy. And a lot of talk about small modular reactors. That technology is proven. The Navy's running dozens of them today, and they have since about 1955 with the USS Nautilus. They've had small modular reactors, and all their submarines, virtually all of them, are nuclear powered. So you could create small modular reactors that can power the entire city of Anchorage, for instance, which now everybody's aware of the drawbacks of nuclear power. And again, that's another 2-hour conversation here. But when I'll just say this: when you look back at the safety record of nuclear power compared to burning coal, for instance, theirs is almost immaculate. The problem is when they have a major meltdown like Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island or Fukushima, everybody throws their hair up and tears their hair out and goes, "Oh my God, we can't have any more nuclear power." And I think they disregard the phenomenal safety record of nuclear power. But that's just one other way that we can help stop polluting the atmosphere. And I can tell you the Department of Defense is working on that. And then the private sector, of course, what drives the economy is making it profitable. And look at what Elon Musk is doing with Tesla. I mean, that's caught the attention of virtually every automaker in the country. And I'm sure this is up in Alaska. You see it. I don't even see the latest Ford ad that shows a Ford F-150 powering up a house. I mean, pretty interesting when you see Ford doing that. And now you're all starting to see ads from all the car companies doing the same thing. They're all going to electric cars. So it's going to happen. The economy is going to drive it. You're going to have more recharging stations. Tesla's got over 10,000 recharging stations in this country. They're going to be more common in gas stations here in 10 years. So those are just ways that it's going to happen.
Yeah, I'm glad I was going to ask you about nuclear. At a Russian colleague who at one point offered to bring one of their nuclear icebreakers to Anchorage, decommission it as an icebreaker and just hook Anchorage up to a power supply. It didn't go over well when they approached the mayor and the governor about it back then, but it's a pretty fascinating concept where that's really all it would take. I mean, there's funding in the infrastructure package to address some of that, maybe smaller scale nuclear options.
Yeah, the Russian safety record of its nuclear powered ships and subs isn't flawless. I'll put it that way. So I'd be real reticent to have one of their ships powering your city.
Just for the novelty factor, though. But probably don't do that with nuclear novelty. But thanks. The thing that came to mind as you were talking about renewables and options for Alaska communities or American communities is, what are the, apart from the kind of moral incentives related to climate, are there targets or kind of federal fiscal incentives to moving away from fossil fuel use to renewables at a municipal level even, or a community level? Are there targets for each state to get to a 25% renewable energy portfolio by? Is that something that's being worked on or discussed?
Yeah,
or is
it's certainly being worked on. I don't know if they're doing it. I don't think they're doing it state by state. I know the Build Back Better plan under Biden has really increased the incentives to, one, build electric vehicles in the United States with union labor, and then the huge tax incentive to buy those. It's significant. I think it's like in the realm of $10,000 or $11,000, which is pretty huge. So they've really encouraged it from that perspective. As you're probably aware, COP26 concluded here last month, a conference of parties building on the Paris Accords. And that's another kind of a sad story. Of course, we signed the Paris Accords under Obama. Trump came in and pulled out within a year plus. Now we're back in, of course, but we're playing catch up. And it's incredibly difficult to get 150 plus countries all signing up to the same thing. They made a valiant effort this time around, and they established the target of a reduction of 2 degrees centigrade in a couple of decades. So, I mean, that effort is there, and other countries some are doing better than we are. Some are, obviously, many are not. But that effort, I know that Secretary Kerry has put a lot of work into that whole side of the house, and I can tell you they're working on it big time as a national policy procedure. So, but I just don't know if they're doing it. I doubt that they're doing it state by state.
Right. I would imagine states objecting to that, but it's still, I mean, I think often in the kind of Arctic climate conversation, I hear fingers pointed at Alaska for, why aren't you doing more to combat climate change in the Arctic? And Arctic and climate became synonymous for Americans versus, one being a regional discussion around development and infrastructure and security. But that climate feedback loop kind of entered into the discussion. And I've seen some discussions kind of pointing to or blaming the Arctic for climate change when it's really not. It's not how that works.
That's to me, it's so ludicrous.
Right.
I mean, I'll give you one small example. When I first got stationed in the early 70s at Camp Pendleton, California, the smog from Los Angeles would cover Camp Pendleton, which is about 50, 60 miles south, routinely, just routinely. And then in the 80s, it started to dissipate. By 90s, it was pretty much gone, mostly due to the catalytic converter and stopping the pollution, a lot of the pollution coming out of cars. I only mention that. You look at the population of the suburban population of Los Angeles, what, 10, 15 million? Right. Compare that to Alaska. I mean, come on,
right?
Come on, give me a break.
But I think that's right. How do we make climate change an American issue, and Arctic an American issue, and translate it out for Americans to really understand those things thoroughly, and the difference they can make. If Alaska communities need to move to renewables, then America's communities need to move to renewables, and American states need to think about it in those terms. I know we're running up on the end of the hour, but you did talk about AML's role, potential role for ARDERs. It kind of seemed so kind of localized regional strategies for economic development related to renewables. Is that kind of the gist of what you were talking about? And I think that's something that we can take up, but tell me more.
I mean, it's kind of ironic when you try to compare Florida to Alaska, because the temperature difference alone, and it's just no comparison here. But Florida's got huge problems with climate change, and I'll take Miami as an example. The sea level rise is coming, and it's happening there routinely. Their biggest problem is they can't build a seawall because the ground is porous and it's coming up through the bottom, and they're going to lose a significant portion of Miami. So they got a sea level problem. And then, of course, when you look now at the hurricanes, and the last couple of years have been the largest number of named hurricanes that we've had in history. And where do they go? A lot of them are going right through Florida. So now they've recognized this threat. And of course, climate change is contributing dramatically to that. And to put it another tag to this, if the Antarctic ice shelf and the Greenland ice shelf melt significantly, they're going to see a sea level rise, not in inches, in several feet. So they have now, okay, we have a problem, and we really need to band together and try to fix this. And that's where that organization comes from. And I think the same applies to Alaska. I mean, there is a problem here, and you're seeing it, certainly with the permafrost melt, which is perhaps the biggest one now, but with the Arctic ice cap melting. And then I think sea level rise is going to pose problems for some of your communities as well. Not so much catastrophic weather, but you're going to have erratic weather too. So, I mean, it's definitely going to have an impact on Alaska. And the way to help address this is to bind together all your local communities and then speak as one voice, certainly to your legislators, certainly to the ones obviously going to Washington, and say, hey, we need to fan this flame and keep it going, and let them know that it's so important to us. And by the way, we need to be funded for it. More so, I hate to say this, than some other states in the continental 48 who aren't as critical to our national security infrastructure, and secondly, don't have the same threat that it is posing to you up in Alaska. So I think that's an important thing for you all.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, thinking about Florida, the per capita impact of climate change is very different between Alaska and Florida. But I also, I like that you tied it back to, you've got to think about it in very different terms, these different levels of risk and threat and economic impact, community level impact, and each of those different spheres are going to
Sure.
have a different relationship to different states and national security.
You know, I meant one other thought that just crossed my mind, because ASP is working a lot on the illegal fishing side of the house. But what you're seeing now is the ocean is warming, all the oceans, and you're seeing a migration pattern of certain fish species, and that could impact you all. It could be positive. You could be having, who knows what kind of fish come up and grow in your waters, but it could do just the opposite and drive species significantly away. And I can tell you other countries are seeing this, and China's certainly seeing it. That's why they're sending thousands of ships around the world stealing fish from others' territorial waters. So it's another thought.
Yeah. General, thank you so much for joining us today and talking through these important issues, not just for Alaskans, but for the nation. Really look forward to continuing this discussion, cooperation. Glad the American Security Project's out there paying attention to this, and we'll definitely keep advancing this within our congressional delegation and up through all the different channels that we have available. And think about the work that we can do on our own. Absolutely.
I'll tell folks listening, they go on our website, www.americansecurityproject.org. All of this is on our website. You can, all the climate change stuff, some of our Alaska work is up there too. So I appreciate the work you are doing, and we're, as we say in the artillery, we're in direct support.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.